Awesome. All right, we're going to get started. Okay, so as you know, we're doing a documentary, 15 to 30 minutes, and I'm talking to different filmmakers about their journeys and their perspective on the Christian film industry. But as for you, you're more steady, that sort of thing. And I know you focus more on early filmmaking than modern. Sadly, I won't be able to interview Andrew Quick, but I'm hoping maybe you have some insight to give as well for that.
So Andrew was not available?
He was not available. I had a phone call with him, and we talked a little bit, but it sounds like he gave me some really good information, but it sounds like he won't be able to actually do an interview right now currently. He said he's in poor health. And so I decided, let's just not do one right now, and maybe later on in the future.
Before he dies, he could die on camera. What a dramatic event. What an adventure. I mean, you could have a great scene.
That would be horrible.
Force him to interview. Yes, of course I'd interview. Yeah.
So I think how we're going to do this is that we're going to talk about you a little bit and your background, and then we'll talk a little bit about some things in early Christian filmmaking, some things that I found very interesting reading your books and listening to a couple of your interviews that I saw on YouTube. I'm going to bring some of that up, and then we can talk more about modern Christian filmmaking and your perspective on that and what you think is going to happen in the future. So let's just start with, can you please say your name and what you do for a living?
I am Terry Lindvall, and I occupy the C.S. Lewis Chair of Communication and Christian Thought at Virginia Wesleyan University. And I've been here for about 15 years.
So what has made you become interested in the history of Christian filmmaking as a whole? Why did you decide, I want to study this, I want to write books about this? What came about with that?
Well, I grew up in a denomination that banned the attendance at moving pictures. And so, of course, if something's forbidden or taboo, you want to sneak over and look at it. And I went to a small college and studied literature and biology, but I knew that wasn't my calling. And so a friend persuaded me to go to Fuller Seminary with him in Pasadena, California. So I went there and I took 2 courses on theology and film. And they both piqued my interest in different ways because I realized what film could do. So from there, I applied to the University of Southern California, and I went there and got my PhD. My PhD, of course, though, was on C.S. Lewis and his indirect theory of communication. So from there, I started teaching at Azusa Pacific University. Then I have taught theology and film at Duke Divinity School, and College of William and Mary, Wheaton College, and Regent University before I ended up here at Virginia Wesleyan. So at all these places where you're teaching both the graduate and the undergraduate level, film just always interested me, as did my Christian faith. How does it really apply? And so I began to kind of investigate what has gone on before, because you think, has it always been this way, that there's been a tension between the Christian faith and film? And I found it wasn't that way.
I thought that was super interesting, because I remember reading Real Spirituality by Robert Johnson. I was just like, wow, I thought that the church and Hollywood always fought with each other, and they didn't agree with film at all. But then when I started reading the early Christian filmmaking, I was like, actually, that's not true at all. They actually supported this for a while. They actually thought this was a great way to spread the gospel. But then something happened with that.
What's amazing is that in the teens and the 20s, churches would have projectors in their sanctuaries. They would actually project hymns on the walls like we do today. So that's not even new. And we find that they were using films to draw in children, to kind of attract different crowds, and to kind of express the faith in different ways. Much of it goes back to about 1911. There was a minister whose name was Herbert Jump. And Herbert Jump wrote the first pamphlet on the motion pictures called The Religious Possibilities of the Motion Picture. And he said, films are like parables. If you look, for example, at Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, you find certain things about it. One, it takes its headlines from the daily newspaper and not from the scriptures. Second, it has violence. Third, the bad guys are the religious people. And fourth, the bad guys get away completely, and says it's a very thrilling, exciting story. And you just need a new title that kind of attracts people. So the parables and the films had a lot in common. And I think a lot of early Christians found that and saw that.
I do remember reading from your book about Jim Friedrich. He started the Christian film industry in 1939. Can you talk about who he is and how did he start that, since he seems to be the beginning of that industry?
He's actually not. In fact, during the silent era, there were quite a few films, and in fact, a magazine called Christian Herald created their own production company, and so there were a lot of films going on. Now, what did happen, however, in the 20s, before I get to kind of Jim Friedrich, was this divorce between the church and cinema. And there was a split that happened in the 20s because of about 6 reasons. First of all, filmmaking became much more expensive. And the church would rather and should rather spend money on missions and on helping the poor and things like that. The arts come secondary, maybe even tertiary sometimes. Secondly, there were Hollywood scandals, Fatty Arbuckle and William Desmond Taylor. And so all of a sudden, the church kind of pulled back when they realized, what is the Hollywood star's life really like? Then there was censorship. They wanted to judge movies rather than make them. And so it takes you away from just really being creative and letting the arts come through. Then there was the problem of Sunday showings. The church had to shut down everything because of blue laws. They wanted a day of rest for everyone. And then the church split between modernist and fundamentalist. And then finally, the kind of the keystone that kind of stopped filmmaking was radio came along. And in the 20s, churches went to radio where they could preach rather than show or tell stories. But then we get, during the Depression, nobody was making films in the church. I mean, the church didn't have any money for anything. They were making new cathedrals sometimes, but not making art. And so it was during the war years, after the war years, Kodak had so many extra projectors, they gave them to Jim Shield, and he went to churches and he gave them all 16 millimeter projectors. And he said, what we have now is an audience. We've got a whole new congregation that can show movies. And so he began to make movies on the life of Christ and the life of St. Paul for the churches. And what's great about his movies on St. Paul, they're like serials. They're cliffhangers. You get to the end of one, and all of a sudden you see that Paul, who is just Saul, who has become Paul, is now trying to escape Damascus. He's going down a basket. Is he going to get away? And you can't find out until you come back next week. And so it created these adventures that people saw the book of Acts as something very exciting for the first time. And this was my curiosity and my kind of amazement as well. When I would see these growing up in the 50s, I thought, this is great. Look how I'm being moved and how I'm being taught. And you could see the kind of hand of God on someone's life who wasn't very perfect. And that was very kind of engrossing. So Jim made all of those films, and he made the dramatic films. We have someone like Erwin Moon who made Sermons from Science. And before Disney made all of his nature films, Erwin Moon made these wonderful films about the natural phenomenon, how a spider can kind of capture and devour a fly, or how a flower slowly opens up. And so he was very creative, and he showed the wonders of creation. And so before the nature films come along, Erwin Moon is out there at the World's Fair showing his movies. And then there were other people like Rolf Forsberg. He was a maverick. 1964, he showed his films, The Parable, at the World's Fair in New York City. And it portrayed Jesus as a clown. I mean, later on we have Godspell and we have other ideas of the Holy Fool. But he showed the clown that came and suffered and lived among people and gave his life for the people. And so it was really kind of a radical parable, because parables in the Bible people don't understand. And here was a film that people didn't understand. And probably the main problem with Christian films is you can understand them. They're too easy, they're too facile, and they're made in just kind of a cookie cutter way that you don't think about it. You just say, oh, that's a nice story.
There's a lot of different genres. Like there seems to be comedy and drama, and like in modern day right now, I don't see a whole lot of comedy, like a Christian comedy movies, if that makes sense. I don't see a lot of Christian fantasy movies. I don't see a lot of these kinds of movies. But back then, it sounds like there was actually a lot of diversity. Why is that?
And a lot of comedy too. I mean, when you look at the history of Christian films, there are little pockets of laughter. Mel White did the Charlie Churchman films. He took the Charlie Chaplin type character and he put him into a church setting. And it was for kind of Youth for Christ markets. And it really worked well. John Schmidt came came on with his Kevin Can Wait and Super Christian, and they were delightful kind of folk art, but they made you laugh. And I think the problem is people have gotten away from comedy. They're afraid of comedy. They don't know how to do comedy. One of the best is Sean Gaffney. And Sean Gaffney did a film about 5-6 years ago called In Lawfully Yours. And basically it's the story of Ruth and Naomi. And it is a romantic comedy, but it is a comedy. And so he says, how do we go for the laughs as well as get our message across?
I want to go back to in the 1920s when Hollywood and the church started splitting, started breaking apart from each other, because I know they made a production code in Hollywood to make sure that they were censoring themselves towards the audience and making sure they didn't project any unnecessary images or words or anything like that. And then in the 1950s, it finally kind of broke apart. At that point, I personally really want to know more about that part of history, about the production code and how that came to be, and then how and why did the church and Hollywood started splitting apart at that point?
I think you can start with William Hayes. William Hayes was brought in during the Fatty Arbuckle scandal. Fatty Arbuckle was a great comedian, a very funny comedian, and he was charged with kind of raping and basically murdering an actress. And he was innocent, but it took 3 trials in California to exonerate him because the public defender was really kind of going for a political capital and just trying to show how bad Hollywood was. So they put in this Presbyterian elder, Postmaster General, Will Hayes, and he kind of governed it during the 20s, but things got bad. I mean, they got wild. Cecil B. DeMille would show all kinds of scenes, and sex and violence took over, and particularly violence with the gangster films at the beginning of sound in the early 30s. And so Hayes had no impact. And you found liberal and conservative Christians coming together and saying, we need someone to kind of take reins over the film industry. And so they hired a fellow, Joseph Breen. And Joseph Breen is the one, he was a strong Roman Catholic. And here's where the Roman Catholics and the Protestants start coming together. You have this ecumenical movement of these 2 religious groups coming to control and constrain the art of film. And so when he comes in, they set up the do's and don'ts. Here are things you can't do and can't do on screen. And so the films followed that for about the next 2 decades. And in spite of really frustrating a lot of art, it allowed, when you're under constraints, you can actually create more clever things, if I can put it that way. You can move beyond. And so you've got the screwball comedies at the time, which were about sex, but they were funny and they were decent. Or you get to the films in the early 40s of Preston Sturges, The Lady Eve, or Sullivan's Travels, and they have biblical ideas in them, but they use a little sex and use a little kind of playfulness and innuendo that make them really enjoyable films. It's much like going back to Chaucer or Rabelais and reading their literature. I mean, that literature is just Christian, but it's so fun and bawdy. And we need to kind of allow those parts to be in our films.
It's kind of shocking. I've never heard a lot of these films before. Like, I've never heard of all these things you're describing. And I'm pretty sure, like, if I talk to some Christian filmmakers or even my own family or friends, they're not going to hear a lot of these films either. They're like, what is that? Why have we not heard of these types of films?
Well, because we don't have the right people teaching at John Brown University. I'm kidding. I'm teasing. One of the books I wrote is right back here. In fact, I put advertisements of the books that I've written, and it's called Divine Film Comedies. And I love comedy, and I love the kind of use of comedy in film and in satire and other ways. And most of these, there's so many films that are religious and theologically significant that are funny. But no one looks for those. They look for the kind of sobering films, the kind of solemn, intense dramas like Scorsese's Silence or something like that. But the comedies like Tom Shattuck's Bruce Almighty have a lot to say to our culture, but we don't have ears to hear laughter. And laughter is so necessary to come in through film. And it's one of the best ways to, I think, communicate the Christian message. When you look in the Gospels, it says that people enjoyed listening to Jesus, and the children came to him. Now, you don't enjoy things that are judgmental. You don't enjoy things that are just critical. you enjoy the comedy that we find in the parables. And Jesus uses more comedy in his material than people realize. I'm teaching a class right now on theology and humor. And so we've gone through the Bible and found so many kind of comic stories that have been ripped into serious modes. And one of my friends, a rabbi, says, Terry, says, one of your problems, you Protestants, he says, you've got to read the Bible with a Yiddish accent. Try a Jewish accent. Suddenly you hear Jesus' words, take the beam out of your eye. It becomes funnier. But we have these kind of solemn Southern Baptist, Oklahoma, Arkansas accent, and it kills it. I'm poking you also.
Yeah, I mean, let's see. So taking that all into account, why doesn't the church right now embrace that kind of humor and that kind of communication to communicate to whether it's the Christian community or it's to a broader audience? Why hasn't the church right now taken those tricks to be able to tell their stories to other people like that?
I think one thing may be our theological traditions. The Roman Catholics have always been in the arts. They're a very visual faith. I mean, you have icons, you have paintings, you have stained glass, you have statuary, so many images. And that icon, the celebration of icon and communicating to people through images goes back to Pope Gregory and goes back to John of Damascus and many other people that say, most people are illiterate, but they can read images. Most people are lazy, but they're moved by what they see. Most people are forgetful, but when they see something, it sticks in their memory. And so they recognize the value of the visual. Protestants, we have always been people of the word. We have our Bible, and the Bible is what we preach. And so our language generally concerns sermons or lectures, things that are dull and kill the creative imagination. And we are, I think, just learning now. Now, some churches, the Episcopal Church perhaps, and the Lutherans have gone into films and been a little more creative. But many of the others, the Baptists and the Assemblies of God, and even the Presbyterians and Methodists, very staid. They're afraid to kind of let the imagination run wild. I mean, you look at some of our great Christian writers, and they're Anglicans like C.S. Lewis, or Roman Catholics like J.R.R. Tolkien, and we go back through history, and these are the people that have excited our imaginations when we read their works. And so we need to kind of, in our universities and schools and our churches, show people how they can communicate in images, help people tell stories to one another. And when we're telling stories, suddenly we become excited. One of my favorite metaphors is Chaucer. Now, Chaucer takes all these pilgrims to Canterbury. And what are the pilgrims going to do at Canterbury? They're going to go to the tomb of St. Thomas of Becket, and they're going to repent of their sins, but they're also going to worship God. And along the way, they all tell stories. And their stories point to morality. Their stories point to the grace of God. There's so many different kinds of stories, and most of them are comic. And we need to become like Chaucer's pilgrims, going on the way to Canterbury and telling stories. Let people who tell funny stories have a podium. Let them begin to kind of share, and then our imaginations, I think, will be let loose. One place where we find those comic stories is with our Black brothers and sisters. I mean, when you find Tyler Perry and his Medea films, they're hilarious, but they are theologically based. He's looking at it through a lens of comedy. And this is, I think, important to understand how the body, this physical body, basically makes a buffoon of us. And we try to be too solemn and serious, but it says, no, be released of your flesh, be free, but also enjoy the fact that God made us the way we are. And we are clowns. And if we can't make a fool of ourselves, you can be sure that we already are one.
Most of the filmmakers I'm talking right now are Baptist or in that denomination of some sort. And it's funny that you mentioned the Baptist denomination. Let's see, how do I ask this question? What is your perspective on, can you talk more about your perspective on the Baptist denomination on making films? because you talked about how they seem to be more in a box, like they're not looking outside of a box. What is your perspective, and what can we do? What can they do maybe to get out of that box, to bring their imagination come to life?
I think one thing to do is to recognize, first of all, that Baptists are great preachers. There are other denominations that people can't preach at all. Of course, they preach too long, but they're good preachers. And the second thing is to recognize there is even still a tradition for Baptist filmmaking. And that's with Billy Graham and his worldwide pictures. Billy Graham would create these, but every story was wrapped around a sermon and this cameo appearance by Billy Graham at a crusade or some other kind of speaking event. He was kind of like the Alfred Hitchcock of Christian films, always having a cameo, sneaking in and giving his message and telling you basically what the film was about. And so we're speaking down to our audiences. And the spectators that come, we tell them, this is what the lesson is, because we don't trust you and the Holy Spirit to really figure out what we're saying. And so we've got to go outside the box and think almost in surreal or fantastic ways. Let the imagination draw the story out. I mean, how did Lewis start with Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe? He had a picture of a fawn, this kind of Greek wild creature with his goat feet and his little ears, walking around a snowy wood with a package in his hand, and then a light pole in the background. All these things, he had images, and he followed the image. We start out with, what's my message? Instead of, what's in it? What would really work? And where have I heard a little bit of a story or an anecdote that I could follow and see how this works? I recently talked to Robert Benton, who did Places in the Heart. And it is just one of the greatest films, I think, all time. And he's such a good kind of Christian filmmaker who was never seen as a Christian because he kept that quiet. But he said he started the whole film, Places in the Heart, with the communion scene at the end, which is the whole, I mean, it's a surprise. And most people that see it don't understand it if they don't come from a Christian tradition. But he said, I started with this scene. I said, what's the story that will get me here? And then his grandfather had been killed. He was a sheriff and had been shot. And he begins the story with this kind of autobiographical thing. So we go into our own lives and we say, what are our stories? What happened to me when I was homeschooled in Oklahoma? Where does that lead me? What kind of surprises come out of that? And I think when you follow the imagination and follow the story, you don't know where it's going, you're trusting God a lot more. I mean, if you look at the stories in the Bible, none of them are clean and neat and tidy. They're all messed up. A recent book that some friends, and I have a 90-year-old cartoonist friend who's John Loyne, and we just did a book called Old Men of the Bible. We're not getting better, we're getting older. And I looked at the end of the lives of all these people in the Bible, and they're all messed up at their end. Even David, whose heart is after God, they put him in bed with a virgin and he could get no heat. And then his last words are, remember Abner, take him out. It's like a Godfather. I mean, he's saying, I couldn't kill these people, but you do it for me. And everyone, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, Solomon, Hezekiah, all of these people at the end of their lives are worse. And you're going, what's wrong with this? It's all about the grace of God. It's about God's grace coming in and surprising us all, that we are not kind of social evolutionists where we're getting better. We're still the same sinners today that we were when we were converted. Hopefully we're being sanctified. That's what my wife does with me. She tries to sanctify me every day. But we still find that there are other attitudes inside of us that are yet to be erased until the Lord comes. And so I think to recognize our sinful nature and to kind of play with it and to realize grace is going to invade and shatter it, that's our hope, to tell real stories like that.
That's really encouraging. I have a very big imagination personally, and
yes.
And I lived in a very I'm a Baptist, Southern Baptist.
I married a Baptist. Okay, yeah.
So and I lived in it, and I had some family members that are very strict and try to confine me in that imagination, saying, okay, well, you need to make sure that there's a message behind it. You need to make sure that God is always in the center of that. And I actually talked to a couple of Christian filmmakers recently that talked about how they're making films because they need to spread the gospel. Like, it's always about God. Like, that's the message, you know? And so, and those films, like, even though I think that's very important, those films are very, when I watch them, they're kind of dull. They're very modern day. They have a very straightforward storyline. And it's very interesting that you mentioned like C.S. Lewis, for example, and I love C.S. Lewis. When I was a kid, I read his books and everything. And you're mentioning how it's very important to have imagination. It's very important to make sure that you don't keep everything inside a box, because in the Bible, like you said, it's in the Bible there, it's crazy. Like I love Esther, for example, and Esther's a fantastic story.
And it's a comedy. I mean, it's pure comedy. I mean, if you recognize how the Jews celebrate Purim, the kind of the Feast of Esther, they drink so much that they're supposed to drink until they can't tell the difference between blessed be Mordecai and cursed be Haman. When they start mixing it up, then they've celebrated enough. And so that's something that we're kind of afraid of, but the Jews really celebrate. But we need these surprises. One thing that I was at Regent University for a while, and we had a graduate school of film. I was fired from there after 25 years, but that's another story, which could make a film. But we had several films that won Student Academy Awards. They were Christian films, but you couldn't tell. And we understood that they were Christian, and they were kind of sent out, and Los Angeles, USC, NYU, UCLA, all the film schools looked and they saw what you have done is amazing. I met Steven Spielberg once, who had seen these films, and he goes, they were just really well-made films. I mean, they really touched the heart, but they had a lot of humor in them. And so kind of the golden days of Regent, when we were making these films and winning Student Academy Awards, we went outside the box. We tried different things. Now, what I would recommend for people who want to write scripts or want to make movies is you have to read people like G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton influenced Lewis more than anyone else. Or you look at the short stories of George MacDonald, The Light Princess, and some of the others that he has written. You find these stories and you begin to read in them. Or you read someone like Flannery O'Connor, who really kind of shakes your world, and she comes to it, though, from a Roman Catholic perspective of the power of sin in all of us. And so when you get into different kinds of literature, it wakens your own imagination, and you begin to kind of think in new ways, in fresh ways.
I do ask this question to Christian filmmakers right now. I ask about, do you think Christian should be a part of your title and should be very obvious in your films? And so for you, do you think that when I say, for example, I'm a filmmaker, should I say I'm a Christian filmmaker? Should that be a part of my title? And should I also make sure that it's obvious in my movies, like I'm spreading the gospel. This is a Christian story. This is a Christian movie. Should we have that in our title, basically?
Should I say that I'm a Christian accountant, or that I'm a Christian shoemaker, or that I'm a Christian busboy? I'm a Christian waitress at Hooters. I mean, what do we say with our, I think if our lives don't show the light, no adjective is going to change who we are or what we do. And so it's got to be evident by the fruit of our life rather than something that we kind of paste on our forehead, because it detracts from it. And it scares people off. If we're going to talk to people, we just talk to them as one human being to another. Instead of saying, no, I belong to this kind of ghetto. This is my little cult.
So do you think one of the reasons why it's hard for youth to get into Christian movies and the Christian film industry is because it's so dull, I guess, because it's telling very basic stories? Do you think one of the reasons why right now in our generation, it just seems to be much more harder to get youth into Christian films when there's superhero movies and when there's dramas and romance films? Do you think that's one of the reasons why, or is there more to it?
I think there may be more to it. I think, first of all, that we simply eat what the culture gives us. I mean, Netflix and Amazon Prime, they're controlling lives now. People aren't even watching movies. I mean, they're watching series. And there are series that really have compelling power to them. The kinds of images they give us, the kind of characters they show, in the storylines, those are things that engage us. And we need to be, first, well-read. We need to go back and read the Bible in a fresh way and just kind of immerse ourselves in that world. And then secondly, read what else is out there instead of just watching, because often we just watch. The other thing we need to do, I think, as amateurs, and amateur means kind of one who loves, Professional is one who's paid. And most students are amateurs because they're not going to get paid. They better just love it. But they go out and you try something and you fail at it. Go fail at something. Go try. Go be so wild that you're making some fantasy or science fiction movie and you're having a little paper plate that's your flying saucer coming down. Just try something different and see what you can make. And that's how you become better, by going out on a limb and just jumping.
So it sounds like in the past, Christian filmmaking was in the mainstream of some sort. Like people did like to go watch those and see those in the past. Whereas nowadays, Christian filmmaking, the Christian film industry is not really mainstream at all. Why isn't that? And how can we overcome that today?
I think most Christian films today still are exhibited in churches. And a few of them get into theaters, but they have special showings. And the special showings, they're marked off and a church buys 150 seats. And all of a sudden you realize this is not a film competing with anything else. And there are no reviews of those films for the general public. Most film critics will look at them and say, basically, they're amateur films. They're ghetto films. They're not the films that our general audience would be interested in watching. And so someone has to move beyond the confines of their own neighborhood and make films and make something that's a little different, make something that's edgy, that really begins to ask questions. And this will happen, I think, when people start doing short films like that. And I think one thing that's great about the new social media is that more and more people are going to be looking at short films. And short films as parables can be great. In fact, I'm writing a book right now on animated parables, looking at cartoons as the new parable. And I love to see animated art. Richard Condy, for example, Canadian filmmaker, did a film called The Apprentice. The Apprentice is a biblical parable, but no one who watches it can figure it out at first. You're saying, what is it about? And it's comic, it's funny. And so we've got to be able to make these special parables that are short and quick. I mean, remember, Jesus' parables were not long at all. Sermons are too long. Jesus never spoke over 12 minutes. And we have sermons that just begin at 12 minutes. Lord help us.
So you kind of hinted at it while you're talking. What would you like to see happen in the Christian film industry? Can you expand more on that? What would you want to see happen right now for the generation that's making films right now and from the generation coming up?
I would like to see students just go out, follow their imagination, and make short films, and then put them on Vimeo or YouTube or even Instagram, TikTok, whatever. Just get those short films out there, even if they are 30 seconds. I mean, look at some of Jesus' parables. What is the kingdom of God like? The kingdom of God, and in one sentence, he will sum it up, and that's a film right there. How can you take something and make a film in 30 seconds? You can, but you've got to challenge yourself to do it. And make something that maybe you can't even understand. You go, I'm not sure what that means, but it's really interesting. And it's got some great images in it. And everyone will, your parents will say, yes, we're not giving you any more money. You're coming home and you're studying accounting. That's the end of your life. But try something like that. Try something different.
Let's see. What Christian films would you recommend to a lot of us that haven't seen? What are like the top 3, 5 that you're like, Christians need to come see these to get inspired, to be encouraged to make Christian films?
There's an answer right there, isn't it? Going blank on it. I would recommend going and seeing some Hollywood films that were done by Christians. Again, Bruce Almighty is just a classic of someone who is given the power of God and blows it and doesn't know how to use it. Tom Shadyack's film. I would also recommend Gabriel Axel's film called The Bet's Feast. The Bet's Feast will start off slow, but it starts off Protestant, but it ends up Roman Catholic with this kind of imagery and this idea of the Eucharist or the communion that brings people together. And it's such a joyous film that is there. There are films like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? I think by the Coen brothers that have elements of this kind of gospel in it. And Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Came from some Preston Sturgeon films that I mentioned earlier, Sullivan's Travels. Sullivan's Travels has a man who is in a chain gang, and he has lost all hope and all joy. And he goes to a black church where they're showing a Disney cartoon of Pluto, and he rediscovers his laughter as a member of a chain gang in a black church watching a cartoon. And so laughter comes into his life. And so we need to move out beyond Christian films to really see what else is out there that begins to kind of cross over and really say, this is a kind of a Christian film, even though it wasn't done intentionally by a Christian as a Christian. A film like Hoosiers, the basketball film, is a delightful film that has faith woven all the way through it. Or Rudy, kind of the David and Goliath story. And you find in many of these films, you're saying, this is really what resonates with me. And I leave the theater thinking about it, feeling deeply about it.
What do you think the industry is going to be like in the future, in the next 10 years, especially with COVID and everything going on right now? What do you think is going to happen because Hollywood right now is going through a whole bunch of stuff with COVID, and so is like movie theaters in general. So what do you think about specifically the Christian film industry? What do you think is going to happen with that industry and in the next 10 years?
Well, looking at the attention span of my students, I think short films are going to work much better than long films. I think, and this is a wonderful field for people to experiment in, because you're not spending a lot of money and you're using your imagination. And one of the hardest things to do for students is to really edit their own material, because you let it go on and on. And it's like Mark Twain said, I apologize for writing you a long letter because I didn't have time to write a short one. And we make long films because we don't take the time to really edit and make our films very, very tight. And so I really see the future in being more short films. People are not going to have the time or take the time to sit down and watch features. I mean, you'll still have the kind of the Peter Jackson films, Lord of the Rings, that you're going to go to and just let yourself be enveloped by. But there are going to be a lot more moments taken with your friends where you're out for a walk and you're sitting down and you're just watching a short film, and suddenly something clicks.
So last question, and you kind of already answered this, but what can you give from somebody like yourself who loves Christian filmmaking, who studies on it? What one piece or two pieces of advice and encouragement can you give to people like me and to people who are going to watch this documentary?
Several things. I think, first of all, get together with friends and watch old movies. Watch old silent films, black and white films. Watch Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd. Watch Mary Pickford in a film like Sparrows, or watch Douglas Fairbanks in a film like Gaucho. And you're going, these films are amazing. They're all about the Lord and his grace and his goodness and his justice. And you watch old films together. And so that's I think, just one thing. Another film I'd recommend is Strange Cargo with Clark Gable, done right after Gone with the Wind. And Strange Cargo is just a powerful film about the incarnation of Christ in Devil's Island. And you're going, it's a comedy, it's a romance, it's an adventure, but it's a film that nobody watches. So that's the first thing. I would get together and watch old films and then talk about them. Secondly, go and talk to your grandparents. Go ask them stories about their lives. Ask them what their most embarrassing moment, what their scariest moment was, their most romantic moment, the funniest moment in their life. Talk to older people before they die, like you're doing now. This is a great thing to do, because all of a sudden you're realizing, I can see through other eyes. And the more eyes we can see through, the more ears we can kind of listen through, the better we are to tell our stories. But we've got to catch other people's stories before we can even tell ours.